You feel it first in the mornings. That subtle resistance when the alarm screams and your body knows with ancient certainty that something is fundamentally wrong with this rhythm. Maybe it's the spreadsheet that waited for you in dreams. Maybe it's the inbox that never empties, the meetings that could have been emails, the emails that could have been silence. Or maybe it's just the cold recognition that you've become efficient at everything except living. And without ceremony, something essential inside you begins to refuse. If I surrender completely to this machine logic, I'll forget I was ever human. Weber called this the iron cage of rationalization, and he warned us with prophetic clarity that modernity would build invisible prisons more totalitarian than any dictator could dream. Not prisons of walls and chains, but prisons of calendars and performance metrics, of optimized workflows and rationalized existence. He saw a future where human beings would become, in his chilling phrase, specialists without spirit, sensualists without heart, trapped in a system that values only what can be measured, calculated, controlled. But here is what Weber also understood, and what most people miss when they read his work superficially. There have always been those who refuse. Not through dramatic rebellion or loud protest, but through quiet, persistent, often invisible resistance to the soul-crushing logic of pure instrumentality. These people carry traits that make them fundamentally incompatible with the total rationalization of existence. They are not better than others. They are not more moral or more enlightened. But they possess certain qualities that Weber would recognize as protective factors against what he called the disenchantment of the world. If you've ever felt like you don't quite fit in the machine, like some part of you keeps jamming the gears no matter how hard you try to comply, you might recognize yourself in these 5 hidden traits. And recognizing them is not just about understanding yourself better. It's about understanding that your discomfort with pure rationality isn't a personal failing. It's a psychological immune response to something Weber saw as genuinely dangerous to the human soul. The first trait Weber would recognize is what we might call ontological inefficiency, the constitutional inability to reduce life to pure means and ends calculation. In his seminal work, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, Weber distinguished between 2 types of rationality. Instrumental rationality, which he called Zweckrationalität, asks only what is the most efficient means to achieve a given end. Value rationality, which he termed Wertrationalität, asks what ends are worth pursuing regardless of efficiency. Modern capitalism, Weber argued, has become dominated almost entirely by instrumental rationality. We optimize everything. We measure productivity in every domain. We ask not what is meaningful but what is measurable. We don't ask if something is worth doing, only if it can be done profitably, quickly, with maximum return on investment. But there are people who simply cannot operate this way, not because they lack intelligence or discipline, but because something in their psychological makeup refuses to collapse value into utility. You might recognize this trait in yourself if you've ever been called impractical, idealistic, or inefficient by people who meant it as criticism. If you've ever spent 3 hours on something that could have been done in 30 minutes because the quality mattered to you in ways you couldn't quite articulate. If you've ever chosen a path that made no sense on paper because it felt aligned with something deeper than career optimization or financial return. Weber would say you're operating from value rationality in a world that recognizes only instrumental rationality. And this creates an immediate friction with every rationalized institution you encounter. Modern research in psychology confirms what Weber intuited. Studies on intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation show that people driven primarily by internal values, meaning, purpose, craft, rather than external rewards consistently underperform in purely metrics-driven environments, but demonstrate higher well-being, creativity, and long-term satisfaction. They're inefficient by design, and this inefficiency is their protection against becoming what Weber feared most, human beings who function perfectly within rationalized systems because they've lost all capacity for questioning those systems. The corporate world calls this being difficult or not a team player. Weber would call it maintaining your humanity in a system designed to extract it. The second trait is what we might call stubborn enchantment, the refusal to accept that reality is exhausted by what can be quantified and explained. Weber's concept of disenchantment, Entzauberung, described the historical process by which the modern world stripped away mystery, magic, and meaning from existence. As science explained more, as rationality colonized more domains of life, as calculation replaced contemplation, the world became, in Weber's phrase, disenchanted. Predictable, manageable, utterly without wonder. He wrote with genuine pathos about this loss, describing a world where there are no mysterious, incalculable forces that come into play, where one can, in principle, master all things by calculation. This means that the world is disenchanted. One need no longer have recourse to magical means in order to master or implore the spirits. Technical means and calculations perform the service. But there are people who simply cannot live in a fully disenchanted world, who keep finding or creating pockets of mystery despite the rational explanations. You might carry this trait if you've ever felt moved to tears by music in ways that neuroscience about dopamine release doesn't quite capture. If you've experienced moments in nature that felt like communion with something beyond ecological systems theory. If you maintain spiritual or philosophical commitments that you know cannot be empirically verified, but feel true in ways that matter more than empirical verification. Weber observed that some people need what he called the beyond, des Jenseits, some dimension of experience that exceeds rationalization. These people don't reject science or reason. They simply refuse to accept that scientific explanation exhausts the meaning of what is explained. They live in what Weber might call a state of tragic participation, fully aware of the rational explanations while simultaneously experiencing dimensions of reality that those explanations cannot touch. This creates tremendous psychological tension in a rationalized world. You're constantly navigating between two modes of understanding, the empirical and the enchanted, the calculated and the contemplative, the efficient and the meaningful. Modern productivity culture has no category for this experience. It treats any orientation toward meaning that doesn't translate into measurable outcomes as wasteful self-indulgence. But Weber understood it as essential. In his famous lecture, Science as a Vocation, he argued that meaning cannot be derived from empirical facts alone, that human beings need to make commitments to values that exceed what rationality can justify. Those who maintain stubborn enchantment are doing the psychological work of keeping alive what Weber called ultimate values, the commitments that give life significance beyond efficiency. They're protecting a kind of consciousness that pure rationalization would eliminate entirely. The third trait Weber would recognize is what might be called compulsive authenticity, the inability to perform roles that feel fundamentally misaligned with inner truth. In his extensive work on bureaucracy and rationalization, Weber described how modern institutions require what we might now call emotional labor, the performance of prescribed behaviors and effects regardless of genuine feeling. The bureaucrat must be impersonal, applying rules without regard to personal connection or individual circumstance. The service worker must display cheerfulness whether or not they feel it. The corporate employee must demonstrate enthusiasm for missions they may find meaningless. Weber called this the requirement of sine ira et studio, without anger or bias, and he recognized it as essential to rational administration. But he also recognized its cost. There are people who simply cannot sustain this kind of performance over extended periods, not because they lack professionalism or discipline, but because something in them registers the dissonance between outer performance and inner experience as intolerable. You might carry this trait if you've ever been told you're too intense, too honest, or that you take things too personally. If you've struggled in jobs that require you to be enthusiastic about products you don't believe in or values you don't share. If you find corporate speak and mandatory positivity not just annoying but genuinely painful, like being forced to speak a language that actively erases your actual experience. Weber would understand this as a conflict between what he called the ethic of conviction, Gesinnungsethik, and the ethic of responsibility, Verantwortungsethik. The ethic of conviction says I must act from my deepest values regardless of consequences. The ethic of responsibility says I must consider outcomes and adapt my behavior accordingly, even if it means compromising my convictions. Modern capitalism demands almost pure ethic of responsibility. You must be flexible, adaptable, willing to say whatever helps close the deal or climb the ladder. Your inner convictions are relevant only insofar as they contribute to measurable outcomes. But people with compulsive authenticity cannot fully adopt this stance. They need some alignment between what they do and who they are, between outer role and inner truth. This makes them terrible at certain kinds of professional performance, but excellent at work that requires genuine commitment. Weber observed this particularly in his study of charismatic leaders, people whose authority came not from position or rules, but from perceived authenticity, from appearing to be fully what they presented themselves as being. These individuals couldn't fake conviction even when it would be strategically advantageous, because faking violated something essential in their psychological structure. In a rationalized world that treats all behavior as strategic performance, compulsive authenticity appears as a liability. You seem naive, unsophisticated, unable to play the game. But Weber would argue you're protecting something crucial: the possibility of genuine conviction in a world increasingly composed of strategic roles. The cost is professional disadvantage and social friction. The benefit is maintaining psychological coherence in systems designed to fragment it. The fourth trait is what we might call metabolic resistance to acceleration, the bodily refusal to sustain the pace that rationalized systems demand. Weber was deeply concerned with what he called the tremendous cosmos of the modern economic order, a system that, once established, determines with overwhelming force the lives of individuals born into it. One of the ways it determines those lives is through tempo, through the speed at which everything must happen. In his study of the Protestant work ethic, Weber traced how capitalism transformed time itself from a natural rhythm of days and seasons into an abstract resource to be maximized. Time became money. Every moment not producing became a moment wasted. The idle became sinful. The contemplative became suspect. Busyness became virtue. And the system accelerated, demanding ever faster responses, shorter turnaround times, less space between stimulus and expected reaction. But there are people whose nervous systems simply cannot sustain this acceleration indefinitely. You might recognize this trait if you've ever burned out, not because you were weak or uncommitted, but because your body eventually refused to maintain the pace. If you need significant time alone to process experience and recharge, making you seem antisocial in cultures that valorize constant connectivity. If you work in bursts of deep intensity followed by periods of apparent dormancy, a rhythm completely incompatible with the steady productivity industrial capitalism demands. Weber understood this as a fundamental tension in rationalized capitalism. The system requires maximum, continuous extraction of human energy, but human beings are not machines with unlimited capacity for sustained output. Some people can push through this tension longer than others, often by numbing themselves to bodily signals or by compartmentalizing so effectively they don't notice the cost until catastrophic breakdown. But others simply cannot override the body's resistance. Their physiology refuses acceleration past a certain threshold, producing anxiety, illness, shutdown, regardless of willpower or commitment. Contemporary research on nervous system regulation confirms Weber's intuition. Studies on burnout show that high sensitivity to environmental stimulation, a trait found in about 20% of the population, correlates with both greater creativity and greater susceptibility to overwhelm in high-speed, high-demand environments. These individuals aren't less capable. They're processing more information, more deeply, which takes more time. They're metabolically incompatible with the speed rationalized systems require. Weber would say this isn't a personal problem to be fixed through better time management or resilience training. It's a structural incompatibility between certain human constitutions and the tempo of rationalized capitalism. The system treats these people as defective, as lacking the stamina or dedication required for success. But Weber might argue they're canaries in the coal mine, early warning systems indicating when acceleration has exceeded sustainable human limits. Their resistance isn't weakness. It's information about what systems designed for pure efficiency cost in terms of human well-being. The fifth trait, and perhaps the most dangerous from the system's perspective, is what Weber might recognize as structural reflexivity, the constitutional inability to stop questioning the legitimacy of the systems you're embedded in. In his extensive work on authority and legitimation, Weber distinguished between traditional authority based on custom, rational legal authority based on rules and procedures, and charismatic authority based on perceived exceptional qualities of an individual. Modern bureaucratic capitalism, he argued, operates almost entirely through rational legal authority. You follow rules not because they're sacred or because someone extraordinary commands it, but because the rules are procedurally correct, established through proper channels, applied impersonally. But Weber also recognized that this form of legitimation is inherently fragile. It depends on people accepting that procedural correctness equals genuine legitimacy, that if something follows the rules, it must be right. And there are people who cannot make this equation, who keep asking, but are the rules themselves just? Is the system serving human flourishing, or merely perpetuating itself? Should I comply simply because the procedure was followed correctly? You carry this trait if you've ever been called a troublemaker or negative simply for asking why policies exist or who benefits from current arrangements. If you cannot accept that something is good just because it's efficient or legal. If you find yourself constantly questioning premises that everyone else seems to accept as obvious, making you seem difficult or subversive when you're genuinely trying to understand. Weber called this the problem of legitimation, and he saw it as central to understanding modern rationalized society. Systems based purely on procedural rationality have no answer to the question, but should we be doing this? They can only answer, is this being done correctly according to established procedures? People with structural reflexivity keep asking the should question in contexts designed only to address the how question. This makes them extraordinarily uncomfortable for rationalized institutions because their very presence reminds others that legitimacy is not automatic, that systems are human constructions that could be otherwise. Modern management theory treats this trait as a problem to be managed through culture building and mission statements. If people keep questioning the system, give them an inspiring vision to believe in, a sense of purpose that stops the questions. But people with genuine structural reflexivity see through these attempts. They recognize that an inspirational mission statement doesn't answer the legitimation question, it just dresses it in better language. Weber was ambivalent about this trait. On one hand, he valued it as essential for preventing what he called the steel-hard cage from becoming totalitarian. Someone has to keep asking if the rationalized system serves human values or has become autonomous, serving only its own perpetuation. On the other hand, he recognized that people with excessive structural reflexivity often become paralyzed, unable to act, because they can always see another level of questioning, another layer of potential illegitimacy. They become what he might call tragic intellectuals, cursed with the ability to see through systems while still having to live within them. The balance Weber sought was what he called tragic awareness, the ability to see the limitations and potential violence of rationalized systems while still engaging with them strategically, maintaining what he called internal distance while participating externally. But this requires enormous psychological sophistication, the capacity to hold paradox without resolving it into either naive acceptance or total rejection. Because Weber understood these traits within the larger context of rationalization's trajectory, therefore he offered a framework for understanding what it means to maintain humanity within systems designed to eliminate anything that cannot be calculated. He called it tragic participation. In his later work, particularly in his lectures on science as a vocation and politics as a vocation, Weber articulated what amounts to a survival strategy for people who cannot fully rationalize themselves. He didn't offer easy hope or comfortable solutions. He was too clear-eyed about the power of rationalization to believe it could be simply resisted or overcome. But he did offer something more valuable, a way of understanding how to participate consciously in rationalized systems without being consumed by them. Weber identified 3 essential practices for maintaining what we might call psychological autonomy within the iron cage. The first is what he called value commitment, the conscious choice of ultimate values that guide your life regardless of whether they can be rationally justified. Weber argued that rationality cannot tell you what is worth caring about, only how to pursue what you've decided matters. This means that maintaining humanity requires making non-rational, or better, extra-rational commitments to values that exceed efficiency and utility. You must choose consciously and without guarantee what you believe makes life worth living. For some, this might be beauty, for others, justice, for others, connection, creativity, truth, or some combination. The specific content matters less than the conscious commitment itself. This isn't relativism. Weber wasn't saying all values are equally valid. He was saying that no amount of rational calculation can decide between fundamental value commitments. You must choose, and your choice shapes everything that follows. The second practice Weber emphasized is what we might call disciplined spontaneity, the cultivation of experiences and spaces that resist rationalization while remaining strategically engaged with rationalized institutions. Weber loved music. He played piano regularly and attended concerts with genuine devotion. This wasn't escapism or entertainment. It was maintaining contact with a dimension of experience that exceeded calculation, that could not be reduced to means and ends rationality. He argued that people need what he called the beyond, not necessarily in a religious sense, but in the sense of experiences that point toward something larger than instrumental rationality can contain. This might be art, nature, meditation, deep conversation, any practice that reconnects you with dimensions of existence rationalized systems cannot touch. The key is discipline. These aren't occasional indulgences but regular practices, protected spaces that you maintain with the same rigor you bring to your professional responsibilities. The third practice, and perhaps most important, Weber called intellectual honesty, or what we might translate as cognitive integrity. This means refusing to believe comfortable lies, even when those lies would make life easier. It means acknowledging trade-offs rather than pretending you can have everything. It means recognizing that your choices foreclose other possibilities and accepting that cost rather than denying it. Weber was harsh on what he called relativists and sentimentalists, people who wanted the benefits of rationalized systems while pretending those systems had no dark side. He insisted that if you benefit from modern capitalism, you must acknowledge its violence. If you rely on bureaucratic institutions, you must recognize their dehumanizing logic. If you accept the comforts of rationalized society, you must face what was sacrificed to create those comforts. This doesn't mean paralysis or guilt. It means clear-eyed participation, what Weber called tragic awareness. You see the costs and you participate anyway, but you do so consciously with your eyes open, refusing to hide behind ignorance or good intentions. These practices converge into what Weber understood as the highest form of modern selfhood, the person who maintains inner freedom while operating within external constraints. He had enormous respect for people who could do this, who could work within bureaucratic systems without becoming bureaucratic in spirit, who could pursue careers in rationalized capitalism without losing touch with dimensions of life that exceed calculation, who could use instrumental rationality as a tool without letting it become their only way of relating to the world. But Weber was also brutally honest about the cost. He wrote with genuine anguish about what he called specialists without spirit, sensualists without heart, describing a future where people would be perfectly adapted to rationalized existence precisely because they'd lost everything that made them human. He feared that rationalization would not destroy people who resisted it, but would simply make them irrelevant. The system would work around them, leaving them isolated in pockets of meaning while the majority adapted completely, becoming human components in a vast machine that no longer needed to coerce, because everyone had internalized its logic. As you listen to this, ask yourself, which of these traits do you recognize in yourself? Where do you feel the friction between who you are and what rationalized systems demand you become? Because recognizing these traits isn't about feeling special or superior. It's about understanding that your discomfort is information, not pathology. It's telling you something important about the mismatch between human consciousness and systems designed for pure efficiency. Weber offered one more crucial insight that might help if you recognize yourself in these traits. He distinguished between two types of people in rationalized societies: those who are well adapted because they've successfully internalized the system's logic, and those who remain poorly adapted because they've maintained capacities that exceed what the system can use. Modern society treats the first group as healthy, and the second as dysfunctional, as people who need to develop better coping skills or more realistic expectations. But Weber suggested the opposite might be true. Perhaps those who adapt completely have lost something essential, while those who remain poorly adapted have preserved capacities that will be necessary when the contradictions of pure rationalization become unsustainable. He pointed to historical moments when societies organized around apparently stable principles suddenly transformed, often led by people who had seemed marginal or poorly adjusted, precisely because they'd maintained alternative ways of thinking and being. the mystics who preserved experiential spirituality during periods of religious rationalization, the artists who maintained aesthetic sensibilities during periods of pure utilitarianism, the philosophers who kept asking fundamental questions during periods when everyone else was focused on technical solutions. These people weren't leading transformation because they were especially virtuous or gifted. They were positioned to lead because they'd never fully adapted, because they'd maintained capacities the mainstream had discarded as inefficient or impractical. Weber believed we were entering a period where such people might become increasingly important. Not because they would overthrow rationalized systems through revolution. Weber was skeptical of revolutionary change, but because they might preserve alternatives that would become necessary as rationalization revealed its own limitations. This brings us to what Weber considered the ultimate question for modern individuals. How do you live with integrity in a disenchanted world? He offered what he called the ethic of ultimate ends within the ethic of responsibility. This sounds abstract, but what it means practically is something like this. You commit to values that exceed rational justification, your ultimate ends, your deepest convictions about what makes life meaningful. But you pursue those values while taking full responsibility for the consequences of your actions in the world as it actually exists, not as you wish it were. This is different from naive idealism, which pursues beautiful values while ignoring or denying their costs. It's different from cynical realism, which adapts completely to existing conditions while abandoning deeper commitments. It's a third path that Weber himself struggled to maintain throughout his life. Passionate commitment to values combined with cold-eyed acknowledgement of the world's resistance to those values. You might recognize this in your own life as the exhausting dance between staying true to yourself and navigating institutions that reward conformity. Between maintaining your capacity for wonder and functioning in environments that treat everything as calculable resource. Between asking fundamental questions and getting things done within systems that have no patience for such questions. Weber called this tension tragic because there's no resolution, no final synthesis where inner truth and outer reality harmonize perfectly. The tension is permanent, built into the structure of modern rationalized existence. But he also suggested that learning to inhabit this tension without collapsing into either naive idealism or cynical adaptation might be the defining spiritual challenge of our time. The people who can do this, who can maintain those 5 traits, ontological inefficiency, stubborn enchantment, compulsive authenticity, metabolic resistance to acceleration, structural reflexivity, while still functioning in rationalized systems, these people aren't just surviving the iron cage. They're demonstrating that another relationship to it remains possible. And perhaps this is Weber's deepest gift to those of us who feel like we don't quite fit the machine. He names the cage without pretending you can escape it entirely. He acknowledges the cost of resistance without romanticizing suffering. He offers practices for maintaining humanity without promising those practices will make you successful by conventional metrics. What he offers instead is something more valuable. Legitimation for your struggle. When you feel crazy for caring about things that don't show up on any balance sheet, Weber reminds you that value rationality is real, that meaning cannot be reduced to utility. When you feel broken because you can't sustain the pace everyone else seems to maintain, Weber confirms that you're responding to genuine structural problems, not personal inadequacy. When you feel isolated because you keep questioning premises everyone else accepts, Weber assures you that someone needs to keep asking legitimation questions even, or especially, when the culture has stopped. You're not failing to adapt. You're refusing to disappear. And that refusal, that stubborn insistence on maintaining capacities that rationalized systems cannot use, might be the most important work you do. Not because it will lead to revolution or transformation in any grand sense. Weber was too sober for such promises, but because it keeps alive possibilities that pure rationalization would eliminate entirely. If you found yourself in this exploration of Weber's insights, if you recognized your own struggle to maintain humanity within systems designed for pure efficiency, I want you to know you're not alone in this tension. Thousands of others are navigating the same contradiction between inner truth and outer demands, between stubborn humanity and relentless rationalization. If this resonated, share in the comments which of these 5 traits you recognize most strongly in yourself. Your experience matters, and naming it helps others see they're not alone either. And if you're ready to go deeper into Weber's vision of how to live authentically in a rationalized world, I have a video that examines what he called the Protestant ethic and its psychological legacy, exploring how the work addiction and productivity obsession so many of us struggle with has deep historical and spiritual roots that Weber traced with devastating clarity. That understanding might transform how you see your own relationship with work and worth. Thank you for walking this path of inquiry with me. Until we meet again in the next reflection on meaning and resistance.